Hello everyone. Welcome back to Voices from the Other Side. Tonight, we're diving into 7 seriously disturbing true highway patrol horror stories that will make you think twice about what really goes down on America's loneliest stretches of road when the sun dips below the horizon and civilization becomes a distant memory in your rearview mirror. These aren't made-up tales, but documented incidents straight from law enforcement officers who patrol those highways where literally anything can happen and often does. Each story is pieced together from official reports, officer testimonies, and solid evidence that can't just be brushed aside or explained away. The open road hides dangers that most drivers will never even glimpse. And maybe that's a good thing. If you're into authentic horror content pulled from real case files that'll keep you up at night, be sure to subscribe to Voices from the Other Side and ring that notification bell, so you never miss our latest explorations into the darkness lurking between those white lines on the highway. After you've heard these bone-chilling stories, we want to hear from you down in the comments about any weird or unsettling things you might have seen on isolated highways. Now, get comfortable as we delve into 7 cases that prove the scariest things on the road aren't always the ones you see coming. Nathan had been working accident scenes and doing highway patrol for 7 years when he got the call that would completely change how he saw the world and what he thought was possible. He was a guy who trusted evidence, believed in cause and effect, and figured there was a logical explanation for everything if you just dug deep enough. His background in forensic science made him a valuable asset to the department, and he was often called in to help with complex accident reconstructions and unusual death investigations. But nothing in his training, his experience, or any of the scientific journals he devoured could have prepared him for what he was about to find on Highway 77 that night in February. The call came in at 2:34 a.m. from several drivers reporting a car fire on the southbound side of the highway, about 15 miles north of the Texas border. The initial reports were all over the place and didn't quite add up. Some callers said they saw a car engulfed in flames on the shoulder. Others claimed to have seen someone on fire walking away from a vehicle. One particularly freaked out caller swore she saw a man burning while standing straight up in the middle of the highway, not running, not rolling around, just casually strolling like he was out for a walk. Dispatch marked it as a top priority emergency, and Nathan was the closest unit. He was on the scene within 11 minutes of the first call, his patrol car slicing through the darkness with flashing lights and a screaming siren. As he neared the reported location, Nathan was expecting to see the usual scene after a car fire. Scorched metal, melted plastic, burnt rubber, smoke still rising from the wreckage, and maybe an injured or dead driver who hadn't made it out of the burning car in time. But what he found instead was completely baffling and went against everything he knew about how fire works. The car was still there, a fairly new sedan parked on the shoulder with the driver's door wide open. The engine was running, the headlights were on, and there wasn't a single sign of fire damage anywhere. Nathan approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his service weapon, his brain struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The car looked completely fine. The paint wasn't blistered or faded. The tires were fully inflated. The windows weren't cracked from the heat. He glanced inside and saw a purse on the passenger seat, a half-empty coffee cup in the holder, and a phone charging in the center console. Everything suggested that the driver had just pulled over and stepped out for a minute, maybe to check a tire or stretch his legs on a long drive. But then Nathan spotted the footprints. They started at the driver's side door and led across the gravel shoulder towards the desert scrub that bordered the highway. These weren't just any footprints. The gravel and dirt clearly showed the impressions of shoe soles, but each print was also surrounded by a dark, discolored ring. Nathan knelt down and touched the ground near one of the prints with his gloved hand. The soil was still warm, not just warm, but actually hot enough that he could feel the heat right through the latex. He shined his flashlight on the area and followed the trail of prints as they led away from the highway. About 30 yards from the car, Nathan found the body. The victim was lying face down in the dirt, arms and legs positioned like he had been walking forward and just suddenly collapsed mid-stride. But the state of the remains made Nathan take a step back without thinking. His training barely kept him from completely losing it. The body was burned beyond recognition, charred so badly that the skin had split and shrunk, exposing muscle and bone underneath. The clothes had been almost completely destroyed by the fire, leaving only bits of melted synthetic material fused to the flesh. The smell was overpowering, a mix of burnt meat and chemicals that made Nathan's eyes water. What made the whole thing impossible was that nothing else was burned. The ground right around the body showed no signs of fire. The vegetation, dry desert grasses, and small shrubs that would have instantly caught fire if exposed to that kind of heat were completely untouched. There was no sign of any accelerant on the soil. No evidence of any kind of external source of ignition. The body had burned with unbelievable intensity, hot enough to turn bone to charcoal and melt metal fillings and teeth. Yet everything else nearby was completely unaffected by the heat. Nathan called for backup. The medical examiner, the fire marshal, and the crime scene investigation unit. While he waited for them to arrive, he secured the area and started documenting the scene with photos and measurements. He examined the car more closely and found the victim's wallet in the glove compartment. The driver's license identified him as Nathan Simmons, a 42-year-old accountant from Nashville with no criminal record and no history of mental illness or drug abuse. According to the initial database search, there was nothing in the car to suggest foul play. No signs of a struggle, no weapons, no drugs or alcohol. The other units started showing up, and with them came even more confusion. The fire marshal walked the scene twice, taking temperature readings and collecting samples, before admitting that he had no idea what he was looking at. The burn pattern didn't match any known kind of fire. The amount of heat needed to cause that much tissue damage would have set everything within a wide radius on fire. But the physical evidence showed that the fire had been almost entirely confined to the victim's body, with very little spread to the surrounding area. The medical examiner's initial assessment at the scene was even more unsettling. The internal organs showed signs of extreme heat damage that didn't match the external burns. The heart and lungs seemed to have been cooked from the inside out, with tissue damage suggesting exposure to temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet the external burns, while severe, didn't go as deep as you'd expect if the fire had started on the outside and burned its way in. It was like the victim had somehow caught fire from the inside, with the flames burning outward rather than inward from an external source. Investigators canvassed the area for witnesses and reviewed security camera footage from traffic cameras along that stretch of highway. What they found in the witness statements was consistent but impossible to reconcile with science as we know it. Several drivers described seeing the victim walking along the shoulder of the highway completely engulfed in flames. They described the flames as bright orange and white, indicating extreme heat, and reaching several feet above the victim's head. But what made their stories so disturbing was the victim's behavior. Every witness said that the man wasn't running, wasn't screaming, and wasn't trying to put out the flames. He was walking calmly, deliberately, as if the fire consuming his body was no big deal to him. One witness, a truck driver with 30 years of experience on the highways, gave the most detailed account. He said he was about 200 yards behind the sedan when he saw the brake lights come on and the car pull onto the shoulder. He watched as the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. The figure stood beside the car for about 10 seconds and then suddenly burst into flames. The truck driver described it as happening instantly, like someone flipping a light switch. One moment the person was standing there normally, the next moment they were completely engulfed. The burning figure then started walking away from the car, moving steadily across the shoulder and into the desert. The truck driver pulled over and called 911. But by the time he had stopped his truck and grabbed his fire extinguisher, the burning figure had collapsed, and the flames had gone out on their own. The autopsy results only made the mystery deeper. The medical examiner confirmed that the victim had died from thermal injuries, but the pattern of burning was unlike anything in the forensic literature. The internal organs showed damage consistent with extreme heat, but there was no evidence of smoke inhalation in the lungs, which you'd expect to see if the victim had been breathing while the fire burned. The toxicology screen came back clean for accelerants, drugs, alcohol, and any other substances that might explain spontaneous combustion or increased flammability. The victim's stomach contents showed that he had eaten a normal meal several hours before he died. Nothing unusual or concerning. Investigators found no accelerants on the victim's clothing or skin. No traces of gasoline, kerosene, lighter fluid, or any other flammable liquid. The chemical analysis of the residue collected from the body showed only the normal byproducts of burning human tissue and synthetic fabric. There was no sign of an external ignition source. No matches or lighters were found on the body or in the car. The car's cigarette lighter wasn't activated, and there were no electrical problems that could have created a spark. The investigation expanded to include the victim's background and recent activities. Nathan Simmons had no history of mental illness, no criminal record, and no known enemies. He was driving home to Nashville after attending a business conference in Dallas. His employer, his family, and his friends all described him as stable, responsible, and completely ordinary. There was nothing in his life to suggest that he would be involved in anything unusual, let alone become the victim of a bizarre burning death on a deserted highway. Nathan, the investigating officer, became obsessed with finding an explanation. He spent weeks digging through archives for similar cases, reaching out to experts in fire science and forensic pathology, and even contacting researchers who had studied alleged cases of spontaneous human combustion. What he found was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. There were documented cases going back centuries of people who had burned to death under mysterious circumstances, often with very little damage to their surroundings. But the scientific community had never accepted spontaneous human combustion as a real thing, instead chalking those cases up to external ignition sources that just hadn't been found. However, Nathan found 3 other cases in the department's archives that matched the Nathan Simmons case almost perfectly. In each instance, a driver had stopped their car on a remote stretch of highway, got out, and was found burned to death a short distance away, with no clear ignition source and minimal damage to the surrounding area. The cases had happened over 15 years, all on different highways in different states, and all had remained unsolved. The victims had nothing in common. Different ages, different jobs, different backgrounds. The only thing they shared was the way they died and the complete lack of any logical explanation. Nathan put all the evidence together into a massive case file. But despite his best efforts, the case of Nathan Simmons was officially labeled as death by unknown causes. The investigation stayed open, but with no suspects, no motive, and no clear idea of how the death had happened, there was nowhere else to go with it. The file was put into storage along with the 3 similar cases that had come before him. 17 years have passed since that night, and Nathan still keeps the case file on his desk. He's kept looking into similar incidents and has found 23 cases worldwide that fit the same basic pattern. People who burned to death under impossible circumstances, with no ignition source, no accelerant, and minimal damage to the area around them. The medical literature offers no explanation. The fire science community dismisses these cases as anomalies that just haven't been properly investigated. But Nathan knows what he saw. He knows what the evidence showed. And he knows that somewhere between what science can explain and what actually happens in the world, there are things that defy our understanding. The car that belonged to Nathan Simmons was eventually given back to his family and sold at auction. The stretch of Highway 77 where he died looks exactly the same as it did that night, just another mile marker on another lonely road. But Nathan drives past that spot regularly. And every time he does, he thinks about the footprints that led away from that car, the body that burned with impossible heat, and the witnesses who saw a man walking calmly through flames that should have sent him screaming to the ground. Some mysteries never get solved. Some questions have no answers. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what happened, but knowing that it could happen again at any time to anyone without warning or explanation. Ryan had been with the Nevada State Highway Patrol for 11 years when he came across something that would shatter his understanding of reality and make him question everything he thought he knew about the world. He wasn't the kind of cop who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. He was practical, methodical, and relied on evidence and procedure. His record was perfect. He had received 3 commendations for service and was being considered for a promotion to sergeant. Nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what happened on that frozen January night in 2019. And nothing that happened afterward would ever make sense of it. The stretch of Highway 50 that runs through the Nevada desert has earned the nickname, the loneliest road in America, and for good reason. On some sections, you can drive for over 100 miles without seeing another car or any sign of human life. The landscape is harsh and unforgiving, mostly sagebrush and rocky hills that seem to go on forever in every direction. During the day, the desert sun is brutal. At night, temperatures drop like a rock, and the darkness is complete, broken only by the occasional headlights cutting through the emptiness. It was on one of these isolated stretches, about 47 miles east of Fallon, that Ryan's patrol shift took a turn into the impossible. The clock on the dashboard read 3:47 a.m. when his headlights caught the figure standing on the shoulder of the highway. Ryan had been driving for almost 3 hours without seeing another vehicle, and the sudden appearance of a person in such a remote location immediately set off alarm bells in his head. He slowed down and switched on his spotlight, lighting up the figure more clearly. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, wearing what looked like a white sundress that was completely inappropriate for the weather. The temperature outside was around 28 degrees, and a freezing wind was blowing across the desert. She was waving her arms wildly, clearly in distress. Ryan pulled onto the shoulder and got out of his car, immediately noticing a few disturbing things. The woman was barefoot, and her feet were cut and bleeding from walking on the rough asphalt. Her dress was soaking wet, clinging to her thin body, and she was shivering uncontrollably. What made no sense was the water itself. There hadn't been any rain in this area for over 3 weeks, according to the Weather Service, and there were no bodies of water anywhere nearby. The woman looked directly at Ryan with wide, terrified eyes and started talking rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in her panic. She told him her name was Sarah and that she desperately needed help. She said they were following her and that she couldn't go back. When Ryan asked who was following her, she just shook her head and kept repeating that he couldn't take her back there, that it was too horrible, and that she would rather die in the desert than go back. Ryan tried to calm her down using his standard de-escalation techniques, speaking in a calm voice and telling her that she was safe now. He grabbed a thermal blanket from his trunk, wrapped it around her shoulders, and led her to the back seat of the patrol car, where the heater was running. As he closed the door and walked back to the driver's seat, Ryan radioed in his location and the situation to dispatch, asking for an ambulance to meet them in the nearest town. The woman kept talking from the back seat, and what she said next made Ryan's blood run cold. She gave him specific details about an accident up ahead, describing a sedan that had gone off the road about 12 miles further east, near mile marker 114. She described the color of the car as dark blue and said that the driver hadn't made it. She begged Ryan not to take her to that spot, becoming increasingly agitated at the thought. Ryan decided to keep driving east to check out her story. If there really was an accident ahead, other drivers could be in danger, and someone might need immediate medical help. He reassured the woman that he wouldn't make her get out of the car and that she would be safe in the back. She seemed a little calmer after that, but she still stared out the window into the darkness with a look of deep sadness. 12 miles later, at mile marker 114, Ryan's headlights found exactly what she had described. Fresh skid marks led from the highway down a steep embankment into a ravine. A dark blue sedan was overturned at the bottom, its front end smashed against a large rock. Ryan immediately radioed in the accident location and requested emergency services. Then he carefully made his way down the embankment to check for survivors. The driver was still in the car, held in place by the seatbelt. It was clear right away that the person was dead. The steering column had collapsed into the chest, and the angle of the head suggested a broken neck. Ryan took pictures of the scene and pulled the driver's license from the wallet in the victim's purse. When he looked at the photo on the license, his hands started shaking. The face staring back at him from the card was identical to the woman sitting in his patrol car. Same features, same hair color, same scar above the left eyebrow. The name on the license was Sarah Mitchell, age 23, with an address in Reno. Ryan climbed back up the embankment, his mind racing to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was her twin sister. Maybe she had been a passenger in the car and somehow survived the crash. When he got back to his patrol car and opened the back door to ask Sarah about the ID, the back seat was empty. The thermal blanket was folded neatly on the seat, but there was no sign of the woman. Ryan checked around the car, calling out her name, but there was no answer. The desert stretched out silently in every direction, and there was nowhere she could have gone without him seeing her. He had been in sight of the car the whole time he was down in the ravine. The doors had stayed closed. He hadn't heard anything. His radio crackled to life as dispatch responded to his accident report. They told him that a missing person report had been filed 3 days earlier for a Sarah Mitchell who hadn't arrived at her destination in Ely after leaving Reno. Her car matched the sedan in the ravine, and she had been traveling alone. Ryan asked them to send the coroner and an investigative team. Then he sat in his patrol car, trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. That's when he noticed the back seat. Where the woman had been sitting, the upholstery was soaking wet, with puddles of water on the floor mat. He reached out and touched the water. It was ice cold. He took photos of the wet seat and floor and then started watching his dashboard camera footage, hoping it would make things clearer. What he saw on the recording made his stomach churn. The footage clearly showed Ryan pulling over and getting out of his car. It showed him standing on the shoulder, appearing to talk to someone, even though no one was visible in the frame. It showed him taking the thermal blanket and putting it in the back seat as if he was draping it around invisible shoulders. It showed him driving for 12 miles while seeming to talk to the empty back seat, occasionally turning his head to the right as if he was listening to a passenger. The audio picked up his voice asking questions and making reassuring statements, but there were no other voices on the recording. No evidence that anyone else had been there. The coroner showed up 90 minutes later and did a quick examination at the scene. Based on body temperature, livor mortis, and rigor mortis, he estimated that Sarah Mitchell had died around midnight, about 4 hours before Ryan found the accident. She had died instantly when her car ran off the road at high speed. She had been dead for almost 4 hours when Ryan picked up a hitchhiker who looked exactly like her, who was wearing a white dress just like the one the corpse was wearing, and who had led him right to the spot where her own body was. Ryan sat in his patrol car until sunrise, watching the investigative team process the scene. He didn't say anything about the hitchhiker to the other officers. He filed his report describing how he found the accident scene, but didn't mention how he knew to look for it in that specific location. When he got back to the station at the end of his shift, he asked to see the missing person report that had been filed for Sarah Mitchell. The report had been filed by her sister, who said that Sarah had been driving to Ely to visit friends and had last been in touch near Fallon. The last known sighting was at a gas station about 20 miles west of where Ryan had picked up the hitchhiker. Ryan asked for and watched the security footage from that gas station. It showed Sarah buying bottled water and snacks at 11:23 p.m. and then going back to her car. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the camera caught something that made Ryan's blood run cold. In the background of the footage, barely visible in the grainy nighttime recording, a woman in a white dress was visible beneath a streetlight at the parking lot's edge. The figure was intently watching Sarah's car as it drove away. Ryan zoomed in on the image as much as possible, and his heart sank when he realized the figure was Sarah herself, watching her own vehicle drive away just moments before the fatal crash that took her life. The wet footprints in Ryan's patrol car stubbornly remained for 3 days, despite the heating system running continuously at full blast. Crime scene technicians meticulously photographed them and collected samples, but they could find no logical explanation for why the water wouldn't evaporate. On the 4th day, they were simply gone. The water had vanished as mysteriously as the woman herself had. Ryan was transferred to desk duty 6 weeks later. He never worked another night shift. His request cited personal reasons, and the department approved it without question, likely attributing the change to the trauma of discovering a deceased motorist. Ryan never confided in his supervisors about what had actually transpired that night. He feared they would think he'd suffered a psychological breakdown, that the isolation and stress of highway patrol had finally gotten to him. But he couldn't just dismiss what had happened. The wet seats had been undeniably real. The thermal blanket had clearly been disturbed. The dashboard camera had recorded him speaking to someone, even if that someone had been invisible to the naked eye. And Sarah Mitchell had known exactly where her own body would be found. She had guided him directly to the scene of her death. Research into the history of Highway 50 revealed a disturbing pattern. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, multiple motorists have reported seeing a young woman in a white dress desperately trying to flag down vehicles near mile marker 102, exactly where Ryan had first encountered Sarah. Security footage from the same gas station shows the figure appearing in the background on January 15th each year, always standing in the same location, always watching the departing vehicles. The gas station attendant adamantly refuses to work the night shift on that particular date and steadfastly refuses to explain why when asked about it. Sarah Mitchell was laid to rest in a cemetery in Reno. Her death was officially ruled accidental, the result of overcorrection while attempting to avoid an animal on the roadway. The toxicology report came back negative for both drugs and alcohol. She had simply lost control of her vehicle in a moment of panic and paid for it with her life. There was no indication whatsoever that anyone else had been involved. No evidence of foul play. Just a young woman driving alone through the loneliest stretch of highway in America who died frightened and far from home. Ryan keeps a photograph of the wet back seat tucked away in his desk drawer. He has shown it to only 3 people in the 6 years since that night. 2 of them dismissed it as condensation or a spilled drink, nothing more. The third, an elderly officer who had worked Highway 50 for 30 years before finally retiring, simply nodded knowingly and told Ryan that he was not the first and certainly wouldn't be the last. He said that some people just don't realize they're dead, that they keep trying to get help, keep trying to warn others, keep trying to finish the journey they started. He said that Highway 50 has always been that way and always will be. Whether Ryan encountered the ghost of Sarah Mitchell or experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode brought on by isolation and exhaustion remains an open question, a matter of speculation. What cannot be disputed, however, is that he found her body exactly where an impossible hitchhiker had told him to look. That physical evidence of her presence remained in his vehicle for days, and that his dashboard camera recorded him interacting with someone who simply wasn't there. The loneliest road in America jealously guards its secrets, and some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Lucy had performed thousands of routine traffic stops during her 8 years with the Tennessee Highway Patrol, and she took immense pride in her ability to read people. She could spot a nervous driver trying to hide drugs in the glove compartment, identify a vehicle that had been used in criminal activity, and detect the subtle signs that something was not quite right during what should have been a perfectly simple interaction. Her instincts had served her incredibly well throughout her career, earning her recognition from her superiors and the respect of her fellow troopers. But nothing in her extensive training or vast experience had prepared her for the traffic stop that would ultimately save a life and expose a horror that still haunts her to this day years later. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, and Interstate 40 was bustling with the usual rush of commercial trucks and commuter traffic making their way through rural Tennessee. The weather was clear, the temperature was in the comfortable mid-70s, and visibility was excellent. Lucy had been on patrol since noon, diligently conducting speed enforcement and watching out for impaired drivers. At approximately 4:37 p.m., she noticed a silver Honda Accord in the center lane with a broken right tail light. It was a minor violation, the kind of thing that would typically result in a warning rather than a citation, but protocol required that she make the stop to inform the driver of the equipment failure. Lucy activated her lights, and the Honda immediately began to pull over, which was the first indication that this stop might not be as routine as she thought. Most drivers took several seconds to even notice the patrol car behind them, often continuing for a quarter of a mile or more before responding to the lights and siren. This driver, however, had reacted instantly, almost as if he had been expecting to be pulled over. The vehicle came to a complete stop on the shoulder, and Lucy approached from the driver's side after running the license plate through her computer. The registration came back clean, belonging to a Christopher Hughes with an address in Memphis. As Lucy walked toward the driver's window, she began cataloging the details that her training had taught her to notice and remember. The Honda was older, perhaps 15 years old, with visible rust around the wheel wells and a noticeable dent in the rear bumper. Nothing particularly unusual about that, she thought. But as she got closer, she noticed that the rear of the vehicle was sitting lower than the front, as if there was a significant amount of weight in the trunk. She also noticed at least a dozen air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirror. An excessive number, to be sure, that immediately raised a red flag in her mind. In her experience, that many air fresheners usually meant someone was trying desperately to mask an unpleasant odor. The driver had his window down before Lucy even reached the vehicle, and his hands were clearly visible on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He was a white male in his late 30s with thinning brown hair and a several-day growth of beard. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating profusely despite the comfortable temperature. When Lucy asked for his license and registration, his hands were shaking so badly that he had considerable difficulty removing the documents from his wallet. Christopher's behavior immediately elevated Lucy's alert level. She had dealt with nervous drivers before, people who became anxious during any interaction with law enforcement, even when they had done absolutely nothing wrong. But this was different, she sensed. Christopher was not just nervous, he was absolutely terrified. His eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, not looking at Lucy, but seeming to constantly check the back seat and the trunk area. He fumbled with his license, dropping it twice before finally managing to hand it over to her. When Lucy asked him where he was traveling from and where he was headed, his story changed not once, not twice, but 3 times in the span of 30 seconds. First, he said he was driving home to Memphis from a business trip in Nashville. Then he quickly corrected himself and said he had been visiting a friend in Knoxville. Finally, he claimed he was on his way to meet his sister in Jackson. Each version directly contradicted the previous one, and none of them made any sense given his current location and direction of travel. Lucy asked him to step out of the vehicle, citing the need to verify his registration. Christopher's face immediately went pale, and he asked if that was really necessary. When Lucy insisted, he reluctantly complied, but his movements were jerky and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. While Christopher stood at the rear of his vehicle, Lucy casually walked around the Honda conducting what appeared to be a completely routine visual inspection. The smell hit her even before she got close to the trunk. It was a distinct combination of artificial air freshener and something organic that was being masked underneath. She had smelled that particular combination before, during her drug interdiction training. Dealers often used excessive amounts of air fresheners to try to cover the distinct smell of marijuana or methamphetamine. But there was something else mixed in with the chemical sweetness, something that made her think of sweat and fear and human waste. Lucy was just about to ask Christopher for permission to search the vehicle when she heard it. A faint but unmistakable thumping sound coming from the trunk. 3 deliberate thumps, then a pause, then 3 more. It was definitely not the random noise of cargo shifting during transit. It was rhythmic and purposeful. Someone was definitely in that trunk, and they were actively trying to communicate. Christopher must have seen the realization dawn on Lucy's face because his entire demeanor changed in an instant. The nervous, fumbling man transformed into something cold and calculated. He took a step toward Lucy, and his right hand moved purposefully toward the front pocket of his jacket. Lucy's training immediately took over. She drew her service weapon in one fluid motion, leveling it at Christopher's center mass while simultaneously keying her radio with her left hand to request immediate backup. She ordered Christopher to show his hands and get down on the ground, her voice cutting through the noise of traffic with absolute authority. For a long moment, Christopher seemed to be weighing his options. His hand was still inside his jacket pocket, and Lucy could see his jaw clenching as he calculated whether he could reach whatever he was going for before she could fire. The moment stretched out impossibly long. Traffic rushing past on the busy interstate, the sun beginning to dip lower in the western sky, 2 people locked in a tense confrontation that could end in violence in the space of a single heartbeat. Then Christopher made his fateful decision. Instead of complying with Lucy's commands, he turned and ran. He sprinted across the shoulder of the highway and vaulted over the guardrail, disappearing into the dense vegetation that lined the interstate. Lucy now had to make a split-second decision. She could pursue him on foot, leaving the vehicle and whoever was potentially trapped in the trunk completely unattended, or she could secure the scene and ensure the safety of the potential victim. She wisely chose the latter. She ran back to her patrol car, quickly grabbed her baton, and returned to the Honda. She shouted loudly that she was a police officer and that she was going to open the trunk, then used the baton to break the driver's side window and pop the trunk release. The trunk lid lifted slowly, and what Lucy saw inside would be forever seared into her memory. A young woman lay curled in the fetal position, her wrists bound tightly behind her back with zip ties, and her ankles similarly restrained. A strip of duct tape completely covered her mouth, and her eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion. She was wearing a college sweatshirt and jeans, both filthy and torn. Her face was badly bruised, with one eye swollen nearly shut, and dried blood caked her hairline, indicating where she had apparently been struck on the head. When she saw Lucy's uniform, she began to sob uncontrollably, her entire body shaking with the release of whatever terrible fear she had been holding inside for so long. Lucy immediately called for an ambulance and requested additional units at the scene, then carefully removed the duct tape from the girl's mouth and used her knife to cut the zip ties. The girl could barely speak, her throat raw from screaming or crying or both. She managed to whisper that her name was Penelope, that she was 17 years old, and that she had been in that trunk for what felt like forever. Lucy wrapped her in a blanket from the patrol car and tried desperately to keep her calm while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. She asked Penelope if she could tell her what had happened, but the girl simply shook her head and continued to cry. Backup arrived within 7 minutes, which felt like an eternity. 2 additional patrol units and a sheriff's deputy converged on the location, and a coordinated search for Christopher began immediately. A K-9 unit was dispatched to track his scent from where he had entered the woods. The ambulance arrived moments later, and paramedics began treating Penelope for dehydration and shock. She was conscious but disoriented, and the paramedics determined that she needed to be transported to the hospital immediately. Before the ambulance departed, Lucy asked Penelope one absolutely critical question. How long had she been in the trunk? Penelope's answer made Lucy feel physically sick to her stomach. 47 hours. The poor girl had been stuffed in that trunk for nearly 2 full days, unable to stretch her legs or use a bathroom, given minimal water and no food whatsoever, breathing the exhaust fumes and suffocating heat. She had been abducted from a college campus parking lot in Arkansas 3 days earlier and had been transported across state lines in the trunk of that Honda, completely helpless and certain that she was going to die. While the ambulance rushed Penelope to the nearest trauma center, Lucy and her fellow officers processed the Honda as a meticulously detailed crime scene. What they found in that vehicle painted a chilling picture of premeditated evil that went far beyond a single abduction. In the glove compartment, they discovered a handwritten list with names, physical descriptions, and locations. Penelope's name was on that list, along with 8 others. Some of the names had check marks ominously placed next to them. In the back seat, hidden carefully under a blanket, they found additional zip ties, duct tape, rope, and a large package of plastic sheeting. In the front seat console, they found a folding knife with dried blood clearly visible on the blade, and a detailed, handwritten plan for what Christopher intended to do with Penelope once he reached his final destination. The plan described a remote cabin in the Smoky Mountains where Christopher would take all of his victims. It described the soundproof room he had painstakingly constructed in the basement. It described the various tools he had assembled and the precise timeline he intended to follow. Reading those pages, Lucy understood with absolute clarity that if she had not made that traffic stop, if she had not heard that faint thumping from the trunk, Penelope would have disappeared into those mountains and never been seen alive again. The search for Christopher intensified significantly as detectives began painstakingly investigating the names on his disturbing list. Two of them were quickly identified as missing persons cases from the previous year. One was a 21-year-old college student who had mysteriously vanished from a rest stop in Arkansas. The other was a 19-year-old waitress who had disappeared from a grocery store parking lot in Kentucky. Both cases had gone completely cold, with no viable suspects and virtually no leads to follow. Investigators now had every reason to believe that Christopher had been directly responsible for both of those abductions and potentially others that they had yet to uncover. Christopher was apprehended 6 hours later, attempting to hitchhike on a rural highway 30 miles from where he had initially fled. He was unarmed when he was arrested, but a thorough search of the jacket he had been wearing revealed exactly what he had been reaching for during his tense confrontation with Lucy. It was a Glock 9mm handgun with a round chambered and the safety off, ready to fire at a moment's notice. If Lucy had hesitated for even a single moment, if her rigorous training had not instantly taken over, Christopher would have undoubtedly shot her and disappeared, with Penelope still trapped and helpless in that trunk. Under intense interrogation, Christopher initially refused to speak, but eventually his attorney negotiated a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for revealing the locations of his other victims, he would avoid the death penalty. He led investigators to a shallow grave hidden deep within the Smoky Mountains, where the body of the missing college student was recovered. He provided detailed information about the waitress, whose remains were subsequently found in a different location in eastern Kentucky. He confessed to abducting 4 women over a 3-year period, though he stubbornly claimed that Penelope was the only one he had ever intended to keep alive for an extended period of time. He stated that the others had all died within days of their abductions. Penelope spent 2 long weeks in the hospital, recovering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and her various physical injuries. The psychological trauma, however, would undoubtedly take much longer to heal. She underwent months of extensive therapy and eventually testified at Christopher's trial, describing in vivid detail the excruciating 47 hours she had spent trapped in that trunk, listening to him casually stop for gas and food, hearing him make perfectly normal phone calls to friends and family as if nothing were wrong, constantly wondering if each and every moment would be her very last. Christopher was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, and aggravated assault. At his sentencing hearing, he showed absolutely no remorse for his heinous actions and offered no real explanation for his behavior beyond simply saying that he had wanted to see just how long he could keep someone alive in captivity. The presiding judge rightfully called him a predator without a conscience and expressed profound relief that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. Lucy received a formal commendation for her actions during the traffic stop, and her quick thinking was widely credited with not only saving Penelope's life but also solving multiple cold cases that had baffled law enforcement for years. But the recognition meant very little to her compared to the overwhelming weight of what she had almost missed on that fateful day. She thinks about that day constantly, about the broken taillight that gave her the justification for the stop, about the excessive air fresheners that had raised her initial suspicions, about the faint thumping from the trunk that she had almost dismissed as cargo simply shifting around. She often thinks about the two women whose bodies were recovered from those remote mountains and wonders how many traffic stops other officers had made on Christopher's vehicle during his 3-year spree of terror, how many times he had been pulled over for relatively minor violations and allowed to continue on his way with a helpless victim slowly dying in his trunk. The Honda was eventually destroyed and crushed, but Lucy kept a photograph of it in her locker as a constant reminder. She looks at it before every shift as a stark reminder that routine traffic stops are never truly routine, that evil often hides behind nervous smiles and seemingly harmless broken taillights, and that the difference between life and death can often come down to an officer who trusts her instincts and absolutely refuses to ignore the subtle warning signs that something is terribly wrong. Penelope is alive today solely because Lucy heard the thumping and immediately understood what it meant. Two grieving families were finally able to bury their daughters and find some small measure of closure because Lucy made that stop and absolutely refused to allow Christopher to simply drive away. But Lucy still wakes up in the middle of the night sometimes, vividly hearing that rhythmic thumping in her disturbing dreams and constantly wondering just how many other trunks are currently out there on America's vast highways, silently carrying helpless victims who will never be found in time. Sergeant Stella had been a part of the Tactical Support Division for the Tennessee Highway Patrol for 9 years. During that time, she had participated in dozens of high-risk operations. Drug raids, fugitive apprehensions, weapon seizures, and even complex human trafficking investigations had all been a part of her regular duties. She had seen the absolute worst of what people were capable of doing to one another, had witnessed scenes of unspeakable violence and utter degradation that would undoubtedly haunt most ordinary civilians for the rest of their lives. But nothing in her extensive experience could have even remotely prepared her for what awaited her inside the converted rest stop that sat abandoned along Interstate 24, or for the devastating betrayal that would ultimately shake her unwavering faith in law enforcement to its very core. The investigation had begun approximately 3 months earlier with an anonymous tip called into the FBI's dedicated human trafficking hotline. The caller, whose voice was carefully disguised and whose number was completely untraceable, provided specific information about some highly suspicious activity at a property that had once been a bustling highway rest stop but had been sold to private owners many years earlier. The caller described various vehicles arriving at odd hours of the night, always with either covered windows or completely enclosed cargo areas. The caller also mentioned seeing women and young girls being forcibly moved from the vehicles into the building and even hearing screams coming from inside the structure late at night. The caller further claimed that some of the vehicles involved had been skillfully modified to closely resemble law enforcement patrol cars, a truly disturbing detail. The FBI took the tip seriously enough to immediately begin discreet surveillance of the location. What they observed over the following weeks only served to confirm many of the caller's unsettling claims. Thermal imaging clearly showed approximately 17 people inside the building during nighttime hours, with unusual movement patterns that strongly suggested that some of the occupants were confined to specific areas within the building. License plate readers captured valuable data on the various vehicles entering and leaving the property. And when those plates were run meticulously through national databases, several came back connected to long-standing missing persons cases from multiple states. 3 of the vehicles that made regular visits to the secluded location were registered to individuals with prior convictions for both human trafficking and aggravated sexual assault, a clear indication of the potential danger involved. The carefully considered decision was made to execute a coordinated raid on the secluded property. The large-scale operation would involve the FBI, the highly trained Tennessee Highway Patrol Tactical Team, the DEA due to suspected drug involvement, and the local county sheriff's department. Stella was assigned to the critical entry team, one of 12 officers who would be directly responsible for breaching the building and quickly securing any suspects inside. The detailed planning phase took a full 2 weeks, with careful reconnaissance of the property, acquisition of all the necessary warrants, and close coordination between the multiple law enforcement agencies involved. The raid was strategically scheduled for pre-dawn on a Tuesday morning, meticulously calculated to catch the occupants at their absolute most vulnerable and significantly minimize the inherent risk of armed resistance. The tactical teams assembled at a pre-designated staging area 5 miles from the target location at precisely 4:30 a.m. Stella carefully checked her equipment methodically, as she had always done before every single operation. Body armor, helmet, flashbang grenades, zip tie restraints, medical kit, and her fully loaded service weapon with a full magazine and one in the chamber. The briefing was thorough and comprehensive. They fully expected to encounter armed suspects inside. They knew that there were potentially numerous victims inside who would need immediate medical attention. They were prepared for a clandestine drug manufacturing operation or a trafficking way station where victims were being held temporarily before being moved on to other unknown locations. What they were definitely not prepared for, however, was the sheer scale of what they would ultimately find. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles moved stealthily into position at 5:47 a.m., completely surrounding the property and effectively cutting off all possible escape routes. The entry teams approached quickly from multiple angles, moving silently through the pre-dawn darkness. On the carefully given signal, they breached 3 separate entry points simultaneously, using heavy battering rams to forcefully open doors that had been heavily reinforced with additional locks and security bars. Stella entered through the main entrance with her team, moving deliberately from room to room with weapons raised and shouting clear commands to any occupants they might find. The first real horror revealed itself in what had once been the public restroom area of the rest stop. The space had been crudely converted into a series of makeshift cells, with walls constructed from cheap plywood and 2x4s, dividing the area into cramped compartments barely large enough for a person to lie down in. Each cell was secured with a padlock on the outside, and several still contained frightened occupants. Women and young girls ranging in age from 14 to 32 were found huddled inside these makeshift cells. Some were lying on bare mattresses, others were huddled miserably in dark corners. Their physical conditions varied significantly, but all clearly showed unmistakable signs of prolonged captivity. Malnutrition, extensive bruising, untreated injuries, and the telltale hollow-eyed stare of severe psychological trauma were all tragically evident. Stella's team immediately shifted seamlessly from tactical assault mode to full-blown rescue operations, urgently calling for medical assistance and carefully extracting the terrified victims from their squalid cells. The women were understandably terrified, Some were even screaming when they saw the armed officers. Others were completely unresponsive, almost in a trance. Stella, wanting to seem less intimidating, took off her helmet and body armor. Then she helped a young girl who couldn't have been more than 15 out of one of the cells. The girl was wearing clothes that were way too big for her skinny body, and her wrists had marks on them from restraints that had just been taken off. As paramedics started showing up to help the victims, the rest of the tactical team kept clearing the building. In what used to be the main lobby of the rest stop, they found an office that was the operational center of the trafficking ring. There were file cabinets full of detailed records of transactions, photos of the victims at different stages of being held captive, and computer equipment storing databases with info on buyers and sellers across a network that reached into 6 states. The level of organization was really sophisticated, showing that this wasn't just a small-time operation. It was a hub in a much bigger criminal enterprise. The guy who seemed to be the leader of the operation, a 47-year-old named Christian, was caught trying to destroy hard drives when the tactical team came into the office. He was arrested, claiming the property was a religious sanctuary and that law enforcement didn't have any authority there. They ignored his protests as they put him in restraints and took him out of the building. 14 other suspects were arrested on the property. Some were trying to run away through back exits, and others were trying to hide in crawl spaces and storage areas. But the real horror of the place came to light when investigators found the underground expansion. Underneath the main building, reachable through a hidden entrance in what used to be the maintenance room, was a series of rooms that had been dug out and built without any permits or official knowledge. These underground rooms had signs of torture, with restraint devices bolted to the walls, blood stains on the concrete floors, and tools designed to cause pain and control people through fear. Seeing these rooms had a psychological impact, even on the most seasoned officers on the scene. Several had to go outside to get themselves together before they could keep going with the investigation. As the victims were taken to hospitals and crisis centers, they started telling their stories. What they said painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for years. Women traveling alone on the interstate had been targeted by people wearing real-looking highway patrol uniforms and driving vehicles that looked just like official patrol cars. These fake officers would pull them over for minor traffic violations, then use their apparent authority to get them to cooperate before kidnapping them. Other victims had been taken from rest stops, gas stations, and truck stops along major highways. Men claiming to be law enforcement officers investigating criminal activity would approach them. The investigation into how the trafficking ring had gotten real uniforms and equipment led to a discovery that shook the law enforcement community. 3 of the 14 suspects arrested at the compound were actual highway patrol officers. They had used their positions and authority to help with the abductions, giving info about patrol schedules and checkpoint locations to help the operation avoid being detected. They had also actively participated in the trafficking. The fact that officers sworn to protect and serve had instead been predators, using their badges to hunt victims, sent shockwaves through every department involved in the case. The scope of the operation became clearer as forensic analysts went through the seized computers and documents. The trafficking ring had been operating for at least 6 years. It had connections to similar operations in 11 other states and had moved an estimated 200 victims through their network during that time. Some victims had been sold to buyers overseas. Others had been kept in domestic situations of forced labor or sexual slavery. A significant number had simply disappeared, and their ultimate fates were unknown and probably never would be. The trial of the people arrested at the compound took 8 months. The evidence was overwhelming, with testimony from victims, physical evidence from the compound, and digital records documenting years of criminal activity. 7 of the defendants got life sentences without the possibility of parole. The 3 highway patrol officers who had been part of the operation got longer sentences because they had abused their authority and betrayed the public's trust. Their cases got a lot of media coverage, which led to nationwide changes in how law enforcement agencies do background checks and monitor officer behavior for warning signs of corruption. For the 8 women and girls rescued from the compound, the road to recovery was going to be long and hard. They were put in witness protection programs because of concerns that other members of the trafficking network who were still out there might try to get revenge. They got a lot of medical treatment and psychological counseling. But the trauma of what they had gone through would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 2 of the youngest victims couldn't remember their real names or where they had come from, because they had been held captive for so long that their previous lives had been erased from their memories. Stella needed 2 years of therapy before she felt like she could go back to full duty. The images of those cells, the condition of the victims, and especially the fact that fellow officers had been responsible haunted her dreams and made it hard for her to trust her colleagues. She transferred to a different division, unable to keep working alongside officers she had known for years without wondering if they, too, might be capable of such betrayal. The raid on the compound had saved 8 lives and shut down a major trafficking operation. But it had also shown that evil can wear a badge and use the power of law enforcement to prey on vulnerable people. Once you know that, you can never forget it. Trooper Landon had heard the older officers telling stories about the fog walker since his first week with the West Virginia Highway Patrol, and he had completely dismissed them as just the kind of hazing that new recruits were put through in every department. The veterans would get together in the break room during shift changes and talk in hushed voices about the thing that showed up in the fog along Route 12 through the Appalachian Mountains. They would talk about how it caused accidents and how drivers were found in a catatonic state behind the wheel, with no memory of what had happened to them. They described a figure that was impossibly tall, with movements that weren't quite human, something that shouldn't exist, but had been seen by dozens of officers over the decades. Landon had laughed along with the other rookies, assuming it was just an urban legend meant to scare newcomers who would be patrolling those isolated mountain roads alone at night. His first encounter with the fog walker came 11 months into his career, on a November night when a dense fog advisory had been issued for the whole mountain region. Visibility on Route 12 had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the highway patrol had been telling drivers to avoid the area if possible, or to slow down a lot if they had to travel. Landon had been assigned to patrol the stretch of highway between mile markers 87 and 115. It was a 28-mile section of winding mountain road that was dangerous even in good weather. The fog turned it into something far more dangerous, a gray emptiness where the road seemed to disappear just beyond where the headlights could reach. At approximately 2:17 a.m., Landon's headlights caught some movement in the fog ahead of him. He slowed his patrol car to a crawl, thinking it was a deer, or maybe a driver who had broken down and was walking along the shoulder. As he got closer, the shape turned into what looked like a person standing right in the center of the northbound lane. Landon turned on his spotlight and emergency lights, lighting up the figure as best he could through the thick fog. What he saw made absolutely no sense. The figure was impossibly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, with proportions that were slightly off in ways that Landon's brain struggled to understand. The limbs were too long compared to the torso. The head was at an angle that suggested the neck was either broken or built differently than human anatomy should allow. The figure was wearing what might have been dark clothing, though the fog made it hard to see specific details. It stood perfectly still in the road, not reacting to the lights or the approaching patrol car. Landon brought his vehicle to a complete stop about 30 feet from the figure and turned on his public address system, telling the person to move to the shoulder of the road. There was no response. The figure didn't move, and the fog swirled around it in patterns that seemed to avoid touching it directly. Landon called in his location and the situation to dispatch, then got out of his patrol car with his flashlight in hand. He took 3 steps toward the figure, and in the time it took him to blink, it was gone. Just vanished. No movement, no sound, just empty fog where something had been standing moments before. Landon searched the area with his flashlight, checking both shoulders of the road and looking for any sign of where the figure might have gone. The fog was so thick that he could only see a few feet in any direction, but there was nowhere for something that big to hide on the open highway. Even more disturbing was that there were no footprints on the damp pavement. The fog had created a thin layer of condensation on the road that should have shown tracks if anyone had been walking there, but the asphalt was untouched. Before Landon could get back to his patrol car, dispatch called with a report of an accident about 2 miles ahead near mile marker 91. It was a single vehicle collision, and the driver was reported as unresponsive. Landon responded right away, driving through the fog-covered curves at a slow speed until he reached the accident scene. A sedan had drifted off the road and hit a guardrail at low speed, causing only minor damage to the vehicle, but leaving the driver in a disturbing condition. The driver was a man in his early 40s, physically unharmed according to a quick assessment, but completely catatonic. His eyes were open and dilated, staring straight ahead through the windshield at nothing. He didn't respond to verbal commands, didn't react to light shown in his eyes, and didn't seem to know Landon was there. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles were white, and his fingers had to be pried loose. An ambulance took him to the nearest hospital, where a medical examination found no physical injuries, no drugs or alcohol in his system, and no neurological reason for his condition. Landon filed his report about both incidents, carefully writing down about the strange figure in the road and how it had disappeared. He thought his supervisor would question his story or suggest that the fog had played tricks on his mind. Instead, his supervisor took a thick file from a locked cabinet and put it on the desk between them. The file had reports dating back 43 years, all describing similar encounters on Route 12 during foggy conditions. There were 17 separate incidents where drivers had been found in catatonic states after accidents. 22 reports from highway patrol officers describing a tall figure that appeared in the fog and vanished without explanation. For cases where passengers in vehicles said they saw the figure approach before the driver froze and the vehicle went out of control. The pattern was clear. Every incident happened when there was dense fog. Every sighting described the same impossible height and strange proportions. Every affected driver showed the same symptoms of extreme psychological trauma with no physical cause. The local historical society had records of similar incidents going back even further, with stories from the 1940s describing drivers who claimed to have seen something in the fog that shouldn't exist. Something that watched them from the roadside with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. One particularly detailed account from 1967 was from a state trooper who had been patrolling Route 12 during a foggy night and had seen the figure approach his stopped patrol car. He said the face pressed against the driver's side window, and the features were almost human, but with too many teeth visible in what might have been a smile, or might have been something else entirely. The trooper had frozen, unable to move or call for help, while the figure stayed at the window for what felt like hours, but was later determined to have been about 3 minutes based on radio timestamps. When the fog finally lifted enough for other units to reach his location, they found him unresponsive behind the wheel, and he never returned to active duty. Landon's second encounter with the fog walker happened 7 months later during another heavy fog event on Route 12. This time he was responding to a disabled vehicle near mile marker 94, where a driver had called for help with a flat tire. As Landon got closer to the location, his headlights caught the same impossible figure standing on the shoulder of the road. This time it was much closer to his vehicle, and he could see more details through the fog. He saw how the figure's movements were jerky and unnatural when it turned to face the patrol car. How its head tilted at an angle that should have been anatomically impossible. How it started walking toward the patrol car with a gait that suggested its joints were bending in the wrong direction. Landon's training and instincts were fighting with a primal terror that he had never felt before. He knew he should get out of the vehicle and investigate. He knew he should call in the sighting and wait for backup, but his body wouldn't obey his commands. His hands gripped the steering wheel exactly the way he had found the catatonic driver gripping his steering wheel months earlier. He watched in horror as the figure approached, getting larger as it moved through the fog with movements that were painful to watch. When it reached the passenger side of the patrol car, it pressed what might have been a face against the window. Landon could see teeth, far too many teeth, arranged in rows that extended back into a throat that seemed to contain darkness deeper than the fog outside. He could see eyes that reflected the interior lights of the patrol car with a greenish glow that no human eyes should have. He could see the condensation from its breath fogging the window, even though he knew that whatever this thing was, it shouldn't breathe in any way he could understand. The moment stretched on forever, and then the figure pulled back from the window and vanished into the fog. When backup arrived 15 minutes later, they found Landon sitting in his patrol car, conscious but unable to speak clearly. The disabled vehicle he had been responding to was nowhere to be found, and there was no record of a call for assistance in the dispatch logs. Landon was taken to the hospital, where he was evaluated and released with no physical injuries. He asked for a transfer to a different patrol region the next day, and his request was approved without question. In the 8 years since that encounter, Landon has never returned to Route 12. He has talked to 4 other officers who have had similar experiences, and all of them have transferred or retired rather than keep patrolling that stretch of highway. The incidents continue to happen at a rate of about 2 per year, always during foggy conditions, always with the same impossible figure and the same traumatized witnesses. No one has ever come up with a good explanation. No clear photos have ever been taken, even with dashboard cameras in modern patrol vehicles. The figure appears and disappears in patterns that no one has been able to predict or prevent. And drivers keep reporting that they see something in the fog along Route 12 that shouldn't exist. Something that has been there for decades and shows no sign of stopping. Officer Audrey had been with the Colorado Highway Patrol for 4 years when she made the traffic stop that would become the most disturbing case of her career. She had become known among her colleagues for having excellent instincts, a sense for when something was wrong, even when everything seemed normal on the surface. Her training officers had noticed this quality early on, and it had helped her a lot in identifying impaired drivers, finding concealed weapons, and detecting lies during routine interactions. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she would find in the blue minivan with the expired registration that she pulled over on a sunny Wednesday afternoon in June. The van had caught her attention during a routine license plate scan while she was doing speed enforcement on Interstate 70 near the mountain town of Silverthorne. The automated system had flagged the vehicle because the registration had expired 3 months earlier, which was a minor violation that usually resulted in a warning or a small fine. Audrey turned on her lights, and the van pulled over immediately onto the shoulder, following all standard procedures. Nothing about the stop seemed unusual as she approached the vehicle. It was a typical family minivan, maybe 10 years old, but well maintained with no visible damage or suspicious modifications. As Audrey walked toward the driver's side window, she did her standard visual assessment of the vehicle and the people inside. The driver was a woman in her late 40s or early 50s named Leah, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing casual clothing. In the back seat were 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, who looked to be between 4 and 9 years old. They were all buckled into their seats properly, and there were no obvious safety violations. But as Audrey got closer to the window, she noticed something that set off her instincts in a way she couldn't immediately explain. The children were completely silent. It wasn't just the normal quiet of well-behaved kids during a traffic stop, but an unnatural stillness that seemed wrong. They sat in their seats without moving, without looking around, without even seeming to breathe. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring straight ahead at the back of the front seats. Audrey had seen thousands of children during traffic stops over the years, and she had never seen kids this still. Even the most disciplined children fidgeted, looked around, and showed some sign that they were aware of what was happening. These children were like mannequins. The driver rolled down her window before Audrey reached it, smiling too widely and talking too fast. She apologized a lot for the expired registration, saying that she had been meaning to renew it, but had been busy with the children and their activities. Her explanation was too detailed for such a minor violation, and she gave Audrey information that Audrey hadn't asked for about where they had been and where they were going. Audrey's instincts, already on alert because of the children's strange behavior, told her even more strongly that something was very wrong with this situation. There was also a smell, faint but noticeable, a chemical odor that reminded Audrey of hospital antiseptics mixed with something else she couldn't immediately figure out. When she asked the driver about it, Leah's smile got even wider and more forced as she said she had spilled some cleaning supplies earlier that day. The explanation was possible, but the way she said it felt rehearsed, as if Leah had been ready for that specific question. Audrey asked for the driver's license and vehicle registration, which was standard procedure for any traffic stop. While Leah fumbled in the glove compartment for the documents, Audrey took the chance to look more carefully at the children. The boy in the middle seat had dark circles under his eyes, and his skin was pale, which suggested that he was either sick or had been severely sleep-deprived. The younger girl's clothing was dirty and looked to be several sizes too big for her thin body. The older girl had what looked like bruising around her wrists, which could have been caused by restraints. When Audrey asked the children their names, Leah answered for them before any of the children could respond. She gave names quickly and confidently, but the children didn't react to hearing what were supposedly their own names. No acknowledgement, no eye contact, nothing. Audrey asked the children directly if they were okay, and again, Leah cut her off, saying they were tired from a long day of activities and just wanted to get home. The children remained completely silent and motionless. Audrey's training and instincts were screaming at her that this wasn't a normal traffic stop. She requested backup using a code that would alert other units to respond without the driver knowing she had called for help. She kept her demeanor calm and professional, not wanting to make the situation worse before help arrived, but she positioned herself so that she could react quickly if Leah tried to run or became aggressive. The license check came back valid for Leah, with an address in Denver, which was about 70 miles from where they were. But when Audrey asked where they were headed, Leah said they were going home to Grand Junction, which was in the opposite direction. When Audrey pointed out this inconsistency, Leah got visibly agitated for the first time, her smile faltering as she corrected herself and said she had misspoke because she was tired. Then she said they were visiting relatives in Vail, but that also didn't match where they were or the direction they were traveling. The backup unit arrived within 8 minutes, and Audrey's partner approached the passenger side of the van while Audrey stayed at the driver's window. With another officer there, Audrey felt more confident about pushing the situation further. She asked Leah to get out of the vehicle so they could talk about the registration issue and check her insurance information. Leah's demeanor changed right away. The forced smile disappeared, replaced by obvious anxiety and resistance. She said there was no need for her to get out of the vehicle, and that she could give them whatever information they needed from the driver's seat. Audrey insisted, and when Leah kept resisting, Audrey decided to physically remove her from the vehicle for officer safety. As Leah was being escorted to the patrol car, she became increasingly agitated, saying that the children needed to get home, that they had medication schedules to keep, and that this was unnecessary harassment. Her protests were loud enough to be heard clearly, but the children in the van still didn't react. They remained motionless in their seats, staring straight ahead. With Leah secured in the patrol car, Audrey's partner opened the sliding door of the van to check on the children's welfare. What they found confirmed Audrey's worst suspicions. The children were heavily sedated, their pupils constricted, and they barely responded to stimuli. Empty prescription medication bottles were found under the front seats, along with zip tie restraints that had been cut off but not thrown away. Under the removable floor mats in the cargo area were more restraints, rolls of duct tape, and a large plastic storage container that looked like it had been recently cleaned, but still had residue that would later be identified as human waste. Medical personnel were called immediately, and the children were taken to the nearest hospital for evaluation and treatment. The initial medical assessment revealed that all three, the children had been subjected to long-term sedation through prescription drugs, likely for days or even longer. They were suffering from dehydration and malnutrition and showed physical evidence of injuries from being restrained, visible on their wrists and ankles. The youngest child also exhibited injuries suggesting they had been confined within a small space for a considerable amount of time. The ensuing investigation revealed a horrifying situation that had been developing for over a year and a half. The children had been kidnapped from 3 separate states in individual incidents. None of them were related to Leah, nor were they related to each other. Leah had been traveling between states in her minivan, keeping the children sedated and restrained, all while living out a delusion that she was rescuing them from bad families and taking them to a better life. She had created a complex system to manage the children, complete with detailed schedules for medication dosages, feeding times, and bathroom breaks. This system was designed to minimize the amount of time they were conscious and able to resist her control. A forensic examination of the van and Leah's personal items revealed journals filled with meticulous observations of families she had been watching. She had spent months monitoring playgrounds, schools, and other public areas, selecting children she believed were being neglected or mistreated by their parents. Her selection process was entirely based on her delusional interpretations of typical parent-child interactions. A parent checking their phone while their child was playing, in Leah's mind, was proof of neglect. A parent telling a child to hurry up or be quiet was evidence of abuse. She had become convinced that she was performing a heroic deed by kidnapping these children. Further investigation showed that the 3 children found in the van weren't Leah's only victims. Evidence in her journals alluded to 4 other children who had previously been in her custody. Expanded searches of areas where Leah had traveled led to the tragic discovery of the bodies of 2 children who had not survived the heavy sedation and confinement. The other 2 children referenced in the journals were never found, and their fate remains unknown. It's still unclear whether they are alive somewhere or if their bodies simply haven't been discovered yet. A psychological evaluation of Leah revealed a severe delusional disorder with paranoid characteristics. She truly believed she was protecting the children. She was convinced that she was the only one who genuinely cared about their well-being and that the families she had taken them from were monsters who deserved to lose their children. Even when confronted with the evidence of the harm she had caused, including the deaths of 2 children, she remained steadfast in her belief that her actions had been justified and necessary. The 3 children rescued from the van faced a long and difficult road to recovery. The prolonged exposure to sedative drugs had caused developmental delays and potential long-term neurological problems. The psychological trauma of their experiences would require years of therapy. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the case was that 2 of the 3 children had been in Leah's custody for so long that they initially didn't recognize their biological parents when they were reunited with them. The extended sedation and isolation had essentially erased their memories of their previous lives, requiring a challenging process of rebuilding relationships with families they no longer remembered. For Audrey, the case became a pivotal moment in her career. She constantly reflected on the timing of everything, especially the automated license plate reader that had flagged that specific van on that specific day. If Leah had renewed her registration, if Audrey had been assigned to a different patrol route, or if she had ignored her instincts about the motionless children, those 3 kids would have remained in Leah's custody. They might have ended up like the 2 children whose bodies had been found, or like the 2 who were never found at all. Audrey became a strong advocate for better training in recognizing human trafficking and child abduction situations. She developed training materials based on her experience, emphasizing the importance of trusting an officer's gut feeling when something doesn't seem right, even if specific violations can't be immediately identified. She also collaborated with child advocacy groups to improve systems for tracking missing children and sharing information between different jurisdictions. The blue minivan was eventually destroyed after all the forensic evidence had been collected. However, Audrey keeps a photograph of it in her locker. Before every shift, she looks at that photograph and reminds herself why the job matters, why every traffic stop deserves her full attention and proper procedure, and why trusting her instincts can mean the difference between life and death for the vulnerable people she has sworn to protect. The dispatch operator monitoring the overnight shift had been routing calls for the New Mexico Highway Patrol for 12 years. She prided herself on maintaining her composure, even during the most stressful situations. She had guided officers through high-speed chases, coordinated responses to multi-vehicle accidents, and remained calm while listening to officers call for backup during violent confrontations. Her voice on the radio was always steady, professional, and reassuring. But the final transmission from Officer Christian on that February night would shatter her professional detachment and would stay with her for the rest of her life. Christian had been with the Highway Patrol for 6 years and was known among his colleagues as a dependable and level-headed officer. He worked solo patrol on the night shift, covering a remote section of Highway 84 that stretched through the New Mexico desert between the towns of Las Vegas and Santa Rosa. It was a solitary job with hours sometimes passing between seeing any other vehicles. But Christian had never complained. He followed protocol meticulously, checking in with dispatch every 30 minutes as required and responding promptly to any calls in his assigned area. His last routine check-in occurred at 11:47 p.m. His transmission was clear and professional, reporting that everything was quiet at mile marker 247. The dispatcher acknowledged his message and noted the time in her log. Nothing about the transmission suggested anything unusual. Christian sounded calm, alert, and completely in control. 30 minutes later, when he failed to make his scheduled check-in at 12:17 a.m., the dispatcher attempted to reach him on the radio. There was no response. She tried again using both his unit number and his name, but received only static. At 12:19 a.m., Christian's voice suddenly came through the radio. The transmission was distorted, breaking up with interference that should not have been occurring, given the quality of the patrol vehicle's communication equipment. Through the static, the dispatcher heard Christian say, "There are too many of them." The statement made no sense. Christian was in a remote desert area where dispatch had not sent him on any calls. There should not have been anyone there at all, much less too many of anyone. The dispatcher immediately requested clarification, asking Christian to repeat his transmission and specify what he was talking about. His response came through more clearly this time, and his words sent a chill through the dispatch center. "They should not be here. This is wrong." His voice had changed. The calm professionalism was gone, replaced by something that sounded like confusion mixed with awe. He wasn't panicking, but there was definitely something wrong in his tone. The dispatcher asked for his exact location and status, trying to determine if he needed backup. She could hear sounds in the background of the transmission that she couldn't identify. The vehicle door opening, footsteps on gravel, and Christian's breathing becoming heavier, as if he was exerting himself. Then his voice came through again, and this time there was an unmistakable note of wonder in his words. "Tell my wife I saw something beautiful and terrible. They are taking me to..." The transmission cut off abruptly mid-sentence. The dispatcher immediately activated the emergency protocol, broadcasting an officer in distress call and directing all available units to Christian's last known location at mile marker 247. She continued attempting to reach Christian on the radio while simultaneously coordinating the response. The nearest backup unit was 43 minutes away because of the remote location. A state police helicopter was dispatched, but it would take over an hour to reach the area. The dispatcher kept trying Christian's radio every 30 seconds, hoping for a response that never came. The first unit arrived on the scene at 12:59 a.m., 52 minutes after Christian's final transmission. What they found defied any logical explanation. Christian's patrol car was parked on the shoulder of the highway exactly at mile marker 247. The engine was still running, the lights were still on, and the driver's door was standing wide open. There was no sign of Christian, no sign of any other vehicles, and no indication of what had caused him to exit his patrol car or where he had gone. The responding officer immediately called for additional units and began searching the immediate area. Christian's service weapon was still in its holster inside the vehicle, mounted on the seat where he would have secured it while driving. His portable radio was still in its charging dock on the dashboard. His phone, wallet, and all his personal belongings were inside the vehicle. His jacket was draped over the passenger seat, and the interior heater was running at full blast. It appeared as if Christian had simply stepped out of the vehicle, intending to return momentarily, except he had vanished completely. The responding officer walked around the patrol car, looking for any clues about what had happened. He found footprints leading away from the driver's side door, across the gravel shoulder toward the desert. The prints were clearly from Christian's duty boots, and they showed a normal walking stride, not running or struggling. But about 30 feet from the vehicle, the footprints simply stopped. There was no disturbance in the soil to suggest that Christian had been picked up or carried. The prints didn't veer off in a different direction or become obscured by rocky terrain. They simply ended in the middle of open ground with no explanation. As additional units arrived, a systematic search was organized. K9 teams were brought in to track Christian's scent. The dogs followed the same trail of footprints to the point where they ended, then became confused and agitated, circling the area, but unable to pick up any continuing trail. A helicopter equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over a 10 square mile area surrounding mile marker 247, searching for any heat signature that might indicate a person on foot in the desert. They found nothing. The temperature that night had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that Christian would not survive for long without his jacket and cold weather gear, all of which had been left in his patrol car. The investigation expanded over the following days. Forensic technicians processed the patrol car for any evidence of foul play. They found no signs of a struggle, no blood, no foreign fingerprints, and no indication that anyone other than Christian had been in the vehicle recently. The communication system was examined to determine if the distorted transmission could provide any clues. Audio analysis revealed something disturbing. In the background of Christian's final transmission, beneath his voice and the sounds of him exiting the vehicle, there was a high-pitched frequency that had not been audible during the live transmission, but showed up clearly on the recording. The frequency was outside the normal range of human hearing and had no identifiable source. The investigation into Christian's disappearance eventually revealed a disturbing pattern. Research through Highway Patrol archives identified 3 other cases of officers vanishing from the same stretch of Highway 84 over the past 30 years. In each instance, the missing officer had been working solo night patrol and had made radio transmissions indicating confusion or distress before disappearing without explanation. In 2 of the 3 previous cases, the officer's patrol car had been found in the same condition as Christian's, running and abandoned with no signs of violence or struggle. Local Native American tribes in the area had oral traditions about mile marker 247, which they referred to as the doorway place. According to these traditions, there were certain locations where the boundary between worlds became thin, where things from elsewhere could cross over, and where people could be taken away. The tribal elders were not surprised when told about Christian's disappearance and said that the area around mile marker 247 had been avoided by their people for generations. A long-haul truck driver came forward 3 days after Christian's disappearance with information that had initially seemed too bizarre to report. He stated that he had been driving southbound on Highway 84 at approximately 12:15 a.m. on the night Christian vanished. As he passed mile marker 247, he saw multiple bright lights in the sky above the area, lights that were moving in patterns inconsistent with aircraft. He had dismissed it as military activity from a nearby base, but after learning about the missing officer, he felt compelled to report what he had seen. Christian was officially declared dead 7 years after his disappearance, as required by law when someone goes missing without any evidence of their death. His wife never remarried and spent years campaigning for answers about what happened to her husband. She formed a support group for families of missing law enforcement officers and pushed for improved safety protocols for solo patrol assignments in remote areas. Other officers who patrol Highway 84 report experiencing equipment malfunctions at mile marker 247. Radios suddenly fill with static. GPS systems lose signal. Dashboard cameras shut off without explanation. Many officers refuse to patrol that section alone at night, requesting backup even for routine stops in the area. The official policy is that there is nothing unusual about mile marker 247, but the unofficial policy among the officers themselves is very different. The dashboard camera footage from Christian's patrol car was recovered and analyzed frame by frame. It showed Christian exiting the vehicle at 12:18 a.m. and walking toward the desert. In the final frames before the camera angle no longer captured him, he can be seen looking up at the sky with an expression that investigators could not quite interpret. Some described it as fear. Others said it looked more like wonder. In the very last frame, Christian's shadow is visible on the ground, but in the next frame recorded 2 seconds later, the shadow is gone, even though Christian himself is still partially visible in the shot. His shadow disappeared before he did. The case remains open in the files of the New Mexico Highway Patrol. Christian's badge number has not been reassigned. His locker at the station has been left untouched, with his belongings still inside exactly as he left them on his last shift. Once a year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, officers gather at mile marker 247 to remember their missing colleague and to wonder what happened to him in those final moments. The questions that haunted the dispatcher who heard his last transmission remain unanswered. What did Christian see? Where did he go? And what did he mean when he said they were taking him somewhere? The desert keeps its secrets, and mile marker 247 remains a place where the impossible has happened more than once and where it might happen again.